So hi, I'm Matthew Rachel Cruz. I'm from the Philippines and I'm a journalist with the Philippine Daily Inquirer.
So Matthew, Philippines has had a data protection law since 2012, and you have a data protection authority. Can you tell us about the data protection authority and what kind of powers it has? What is the structure? Who's on the authority as such?
Yeah. Okay, so the National Privacy Commission, or NPC, is what it's called in the Philippines. And essentially, it has a very broad range of powers under the Data Privacy Act of 2012. Okay. It's made up of a commissioner and 2 deputy commissioners. The current commissioner is the very first commissioner that it's had. And so the law was passed under the previous administration, and the commissioner's been a holdover from then. So first and only commissioner. But actually, even though the law was passed in 2012, it only really started to take effect in 2016 when the implementing rules and regulations were passed. So 4 years after the initial passing of the law. Essentially, the powers that it has, it's a rulemaking body, so it has the power to build on the Data Privacy Act essentially by issuing circulars that could compel companies to comply, or in terms of coming up with additional regulations for companies to comply with. It also has a quasi-judicial function, so it can't actually prosecute people for violating the act, but it has the power to conduct investigations, to receive formal complaints, to initiate the fact-finding body in terms of those complaints, and then on its own, it can actually impose administrative fines. But in terms of criminal prosecution, it would then refer that to the Department of Justice.
So what's been the experience so far in terms of like how many complaints have been filed? Is there any transparency there?
Yeah.
How many companies have been prosecuted? How many have been fined? How many have there been criminal prosecutions against? Has it improved things to have a data protection authority?
Right. So that's an interesting question. I think that a lot of people would argue that it hasn't really done as much as it could, although of course its powers are also limited by the law in that sense, because the biggest data leak that happened in the Philippines actually happened less than a month after the National Privacy Commission started to really take effect. Okay. So this was a breach on the Commission on Elections. So 55 million voters' data was leaked on a searchable website, so you could search for anything, their full names, their addresses, their birthdays, all of that. So this was really seen as a big test for how effective the NPC could actually be. And it ended up being that it recommended the prosecution of the chairman at the time of the Commission on Elections, but then the Department of Justice never acted on that recommendation. So essentially no one has really been held accountable for that leak. And now it's been 3 years since then. People have largely forgotten about it. There have been several data breaches. It happens actually on a fairly regular basis with private companies. And so under the law, they're required to disclose those breaches to the NPC within 72 hours. And the NPC is generally good about making those disclosures public. But then after it's made those disclosures public, it's not very good about being transparent in terms of what actions it's then taken to enforce compliance, or what mandates that it issued, if ever, to those companies in order to comply. So all of those are a little bit murky. They have said that their main goal is to get these companies to comply with the orders that they issue in terms of sort of cleaning up their internal processes rather than prosecuting them or issuing the fines. I think that they're afraid that that will have a deterring effect on companies in terms of them not wanting to comply or have a data protection officer. But I think that, of course, a counterpoint could be made that it's essentially made that companies aren't really scared of this commission, aren't really feeling the pressure to comply with the mandates under the Data Privacy Act.
So if you think that the authority had to be reconstituted or it had to be given additional powers, what do you think should change now that you have experience behind you as a country? What would make it better?
That's a good question. I think that, well, for one, I think that it is still a relatively young body. So I think that even as journalists, even civil society are still sort of together with the commission, trying to figure out what the best way forward is, what its place is in terms of how strict it should be, how lenient it should be in terms of regulation. I think that, for one, just general transparency would go a long way to allaying some of the concerns in regards to just how compliant these companies actually are. Because, like I said, it doesn't, its public releases have been that companies that it issues compliance orders with have been compliant with those orders, but we don't know what exactly those orders were or what actually changes were actually made in those companies. And so I think that it goes back to just that having that trust that is actually that the companies are complying, because obviously there is that mistrust, especially now when it comes to how private corporations handle data. So I think that one, I'm not sure if that, how exactly to operationalize more transparency, but I'm sure that would be something that would help it more. I don't know if it should be given more powers in terms of liability, criminal liability, holding people liable, because I do think that it does have the power to impose fines, and I think that maybe it should be using that power more often, because there actually hasn't been a company that's been fined under the Act. So essentially, it's all just been, the companies, when they have a breach, for example, they're issued a compliance order, and then that's the end of it. So I think that, having that fine would serve to sort of show other companies that the NPC is serious about enforcing these powers. I think that another major problem right now is that since the Act requires every corporation to have a data protection officer or a DPO, and one of the big problems that we're having now is that there aren't enough data protection officers to fill the demand in terms of the number of companies. So I think that's another thing that we really need to be focusing on moving forward.
Okay. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.